The justification of imperialism. So, imperialism is driven by new technologies. It's driven by new medicines like quinine. It's driven by new military technologies. It's usually pursued because the mother country, France or Britain, for example, they seek to obtain cheap raw material resources that can be used in their manufacturing industry, for example. They are seeking economic gain. They're seeking greater global reach for its militaries and its navy. They're seeking to become world powers. The justification of imperialism was racism. And this advertisement that you see right here is a perfect example of this. This is an advertisement for a soap company from the age of imperialism. This is a Pears soap ad. And the caption reads, "The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. Pears soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances, while amongst the cultured of all nations it holds its highest place. The ideal toilet soap." So that is an advertisement for soap, but the advertisement itself is a historical document that really conveys to the student of history the deeply racist justification of colonialism and imperialism. This was known as the white man's burden, and this is sometimes gleaned from a Rudyard Kipling poem from the age. And basically what the white man's burden, what this suggested was that Western Europeans were racially and culturally superior to people of the developing world. And as a result of that, Europeans who were largely champions of colonialism and imperialism, though not necessarily all individuals in Western Europe, but colonialists and imperialists justified colonialism and imperialism on the basis of that notion of racial and cultural superiority. They argued, I should say, that they had a responsibility, that white men, white Western European civilization, had a responsibility to, quote, civilize and control other people in the developing world. That, in fact, the propaganda, what they're saying here in their propaganda, is that colonialism was somehow good because colonialism was bringing civilization to other peoples. And of course, we know that this is propaganda. This is how they're justifying imperialism. The real motivation of the imperialists is to effectively steal resources. It's effectively for Western Europeans to become significant global powers by capitalizing economically on the resources and territories of other individuals, and to use those as places to extend the global reach of navies and armies. But the justification for imperialism was a deep-seated racism, which claimed that Europeans were in fact bringing civilization to people of the developing world. And there's a long legacy of this sort of like racist thinking in world history, and it carries really, really extreme consequences. So the study of anthropology, the modern study of anthropology, which anthropology is basically the study of humans and the study of human societies and civilizations, the way people have lived and the way people's living has changed over time, if you will. And anthropologists will sometimes study human remains. And, forensic anthropologists do use racial categories in the 21st century. And you see examples of those right here. However, the difference between what a forensic anthropologist is doing and these pseudoscientists were doing in the 1800s is that this is just for identification purposes. There is no assumption that, for example, skull shape or so forth has any correspondence to culture or intelligence. the pseudoscientists of the imperial age argued that different races directly correlated to intelligence, to level of development and advancement. And so your racist pseudoscience thinkers during the 1800s would have argued that the Caucasoid individual was the most advanced of Western civilization, and that all of the other so-called races, though we know in and of itself, race itself doesn't even exist. We know that humans are effectively all genetically identical, but they would argue that these differences in perception, whether it's skull shape or skin complexion or hair, those racist scientists of the 1800s, those pseudoscientists, would have argued that that corresponded to lower civilization, lower development, and a myriad of different types of prejudice and stereotypes against those people. That somehow, for example, they might argue that an Asian person was hardworking and thrifty, but prone to deception. They might argue that a person from Africa was prone to laziness. These are the types of stereotypes and discriminatory prejudices that were constructed during the age of imperialism by pseudoscientists in the 19th century. And of course, the long-running consequences of racial thinking is incredibly and profoundly destructive in human societies and world history. The pseudoscientist who is usually most associated with the development of what you might call racism, modern racism, would be the French aristocrat Comte Arthur de Gobineau. And Gobineau wrote an essay called The Essay on the Inequality of Races, which was published in 1855. And he argued that race was basically the driving force of history. And many of these thinkers, too, would argue that somehow Western civilization was facing a process of degeneration and decline because of increasing sort of ideas. Liberalism, socialism were oftentimes associated with this, and that it was important, these racist theorists would argue, that Europeans had to extend out, control, and promote Western civilization, lest European Western civilization decline. So these thinkers would have advocated very staunchly that under any circumstances, people should never be involved, for example, in multi-ethnic or multiracial relationships, that sex and reproduction between a Western so-called white person and an indigenous person or an African person or an Asian person would result in the genetic decline of Western European civilization. And this really speaks to the intense racism and racist thinking that was involved in justifying imperialism. There's a very, very long and destructive legacy of these ideas in history following. The most extreme is probably that in Germany. So Gobineau's ideas were really sort of captured upon by Max Nordau, who popularized this idea in a publication called Degeneration in 1893. And effectively, he was building on Gobineau's ideas that equated, racial purity or lack thereof with either national rise or national decline. And so increasingly, imperial powers adopted these ideas. These ideas justified extreme cases of repression in colonial territories. And of course, when you come to Germany in the early 20th century, you will increasingly see these ideas of racism be applied to national ideas, to anti-Semitic thinking, and to a myriad of different types of sort of programs and policies across the West. And of course, Germany, Nazi Germany, was an example of the most extreme destructive consequence of racist thinking in world history, as of course the Nazis believed that they were seeking to promote a racially pure Aryan empire, and as a result of that, they had to prevent the association with, whether through reproduction or education, with any group that was deemed to be racially inferior. And this led, of course, to the Holocaust, and of course a myriad of brutal actions committed against Jewish people, Slavic people, individuals who were handicapped or disabled, I should say, as well. As all of those individuals were seen as genetically inferior, and because they were seen as genetically inferior, they were deemed as threatening what they would call blood poisoning, threatening the genetic decline of German sort of civilization. And so racism is the justification of colonialism. Colonialism inherently advances and expands racist thinking, and that has devastating consequences for the colonized, and it also has devastating consequences for the people in both the Americas, Western Europe, and even Asia.